What kind of man flies through the air with the greatest of ease, spinning and turning dangerously, and says he does it all to clear his head so he can return to his drawing board and meet a deadline 5 times a week? Pat Oliphant, Pulitzer Prize-winning political cartoonist of the Denver Post.
Is Pat Oliphant really a threat to the American political system? Some seem to think so. His irreverent cartoons poke fun at the establishment and poke fun about the credibility of U.S. leaders. Political satirist Art Buchwald says of Oliphant, "If I were in the White House, I'd lock him up and throw away the key."
He is probably the most widely published political cartoonist in the country, maybe in the entire world.
His formula for insult is largely unrivaled. He's been called the most influential editorial cartoonist of the day by the New York Times.
Oliphant has this unique ability to go into the soul of the person he's working on and to literally draw out the essence from them.
Oliphant has been called the most imitated political cartoonist in the United States. And one critic has said of him, if Pat Oliphant couldn't draw, he'd be an assassin.
The truth is, you haven't really made it in Washington until Pat Oliphant has made fun of you. Oliphant likes to say a cartoonist should be seen and not heard. He is a man of few words, but then all he really needs is one picture and lots of politicians.
To me, his work, it's kind of a through line through the insanity of America.
Did you see your work affect public opinion?
That's a good question, isn't it? Why did you have to give me that one? With this work, you go from day to day, whatever the world's bringing at you, and you put it down as a linear depiction of what's going on. And you hope you're noting history at the same time. Did I influence public opinion? I'd like to think so. I really don't collect that sort of thing. I don't really know. Down the road, when people look at that work, the drawing is all a personal observation. That's why I liked this country. It was marvelous. People were so accepting of some stranger who came in and started drawing about their country. And they were so forbearing. Of course, I got my share of the letters, "You son of a bitch, why don't you go back where you came from?" You get used to that too.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome political cartoonist and association executive, Pat Oliphant.
I'm from Australia, therefore I come by this accent honestly. It is not a speech affliction.
He lived out in the country. His father moved him out in the country, so there were no playmates around. And so he lived a lot in his head. And he started drawing when he was maybe about 3 years old.
He grew up with a love of drawing, in part because his father was a draftsman who did work for the Australian government, and he saw his father drawing and wanted to try his own hand at it, and quickly it became a passion for him.
His father painted the side of the house, and so did he.
He had this old house up in the hills, and I did one of my first big pieces on his wall. Strange thing, he didn't get pissed. He just left it alone, painted it over.
His family was kind of a famous family in Australia at that time. because his uncle was Sir Mark Oliphant, who was known for his scientific contributions to the development of the atom bomb. And part of the background to the story of Oppenheimer. So people knew Sir Mark. His reputation was known throughout Australia. And I think part of what motivated my father to become great in his own right was he got tired of always being asked if he was related to Sir Mark, and he wanted to be his own guy.
His first job at 18 was as a copy boy, earning £3 a week with the Murdoch-owned Adelaide News.
I got into it, as most people do, by osmosis and accident. I started out in a newspaper with the intention of being a journalist, I believe, but drawing one out.
He and a friend, they were making some pitiful amount of money, a few dollars a week, and they decided to heck with this and let's move across town to the other newspaper.
My mom and dad met at the Adelaide Advertiser, where they were both working in the late 1950s. They got married. My older sister, Laura, was born in January of 1959, and then I came along at the very last day of 1960.
And then I became a press artist, which means you draw maps and things like that, retouch photos and things like that.
Whatever was needed at the time.
Whatever was needed, and cartooning along with that. And then I became a cartoonist when the cartoonists they had then left to join the opposition. So that suited me fine, and that was in 1955. So
did you have to audition for the job, or did they know you were?
Well, they had seen me drawing around the place.
Right.
So that's one of those things of being in the right place at the right time, I guess.
It paid £1 more, but you had to work nights. There's always something.
He never liked it, but only realized quite how much he hated it when, in 1959, he went on a world study tour. When he got back, small-town Adelaide seemed to have shrunk even further.
This being a family newspaper, you painted the testicles off bulls and things like this and just cleaned everything up.
They would send him off to record some fancy party. And there would be this important person and that important person. In the middle would be this short, stubby, fat little lady or something. They would make him cut her out, put those other two pieces together.
Australia's a place in the world where nothing happens. So you're reduced to drawing cartoons about the weather. My newspaper, being a very positive crusader for all sorts of things, always came out very strongly for the weather.
He got tired of these potentates telling him what to do and how to do it, and they wouldn't let him say things he wanted to say. This penguin washed up on the shore, and somebody brought him into the office, and they named the penguin Punk. Anyway, Patrick decided to put Punk in his drawings.
So that I could get my own ideas into my own cartoons, I invented this guy, and it became very popular of its own accord, his own accord. He took on a life of his own and has been that way ever since.
Everybody likes penguins, as far as I know.
Punk was really a voice of free expression in the context of what he would later invent as the ultimate form of self-expression through the entire cartoon.
Then he said he wanted to leave Australia because everybody's gone to the beach. Nobody really cares about what's going on in the political world.
America called to him because that's where the art was happening. It was the center of political foment in the world, it was the center of progress in the world, and it was the center of his profession, which was cartooning. My father, he had a very clear idea very early on who he was and what he wanted. He doesn't get there without my mom in his life. This woman that he falls in love with turns out to be an immigrant from Amsterdam with the same wanderlust for the world that he had, and a complete willingness, at kind of a moment's notice, to uproot their new family, to move to a completely new country, and gamble on a whole new career because they believed they could make it happen.
American cartooning had, by and large, been looked down upon in other parts of the world. It seemed that the art had run down and it just wasn't doing its job anymore. So I felt that perhaps I could inject something new into it by applying all this sort of thing I was doing in Australia.
And so he started looking around and he found through a friend that the cartoonist at the Denver Post, Paul Conrad, had left, and he went to the LA Times. The owner of the paper said, well, what's an Australian going to know about politics in America? And the other guy said, well, he's going to pay his own way here, so why don't we find out?
He was still pretty raw. One of his fellow cartoonists wrote at the time that in the trade, we all sat back to see how long it would take the kid to catch on to the American scene. He needed about 5 minutes.
Humor translates fairly well, but there was an educating of the audience process. I drew so differently to anything they had before, so this was a new thing for the audience.
And the audience loved it. With his satire and spiky caricatures, he helped create a whole new style of cartooning.
His influences were not just artistic, and they weren't necessarily just painting or cartooning. He was clearly influenced by the political dialogue in Mad Magazine. What he respected was people who were willing to thumb their nose at authority in a creative, smart way. Anybody who was doing that was, for him, an influence. He was also friends with Hunter S. Thompson. I've often thought he was kind of the Hunter S. Thompson of cartooning. He's just this person who was willing to ask questions nobody else was willing to ask. At school, when we said our last name, everybody immediately asked, are you related to Pat Oliphant? That didn't happen right away, but it happened stunningly quickly because he won a Pulitzer Prize within a couple of years of arriving in America.
Do you ever draw a cartoon that you wish you could take back?
Oh, well, that's going back years to when I won the Pulitzer. I wish I could take that back.
Okay.
The Pulitzer Prize, I feel, well, there's a very good reason it's not in there. It's just simply that I wasn't pleased with the cartoon that was chosen to represent my work. Well, let me describe the cartoon. It was during the Vietnam War when we were trying to bring Ho Chi Minh to the peace table by bombing the hell out of everything. And it was a hawkish sort of cartoon. It had Ho Chi Minh holding a dead Vietnamese, smoking bombs everywhere, and he's saying, they won't bring us to the peace table, will they?
We had this editor, a cigar-chewing asshole, who was drunk most of the time. He had changed the caption to read differently than what I had, and just deballed it.
Took the punch out of it.
Yeah. That's what that means.
Thank you.
I studied the books that had won the Pulitzer Prize. There is a book in existence of all the winners from way back in the 20s. And it seemed to me that there was a sameness about all these cartoons. So I included this one cartoon in with 11 others, which I thought were good cartoons. I then waited for the results, and it turned out I won it. And the one that had been selected to typify my work for the entire year was this particular cartoon.
That just affirmed for him something which he firmly believed, which was that prizes are bullshit.
Political cartooning began in the Reformation. When Martin Luther broke from the Catholic Church, the Protestant Netherlands began turning out cartoons making fun of the Pope, and the Catholic Italians made cartoons making fun of Martin Luther. Unfortunately for the Catholics, the best artists were on the Protestant side. And then came engraving. That changed the style of drawing. And then came etching.
In England, in the 18th century, Rowlandson and Gilray were tilting at the establishment. Was also active in France during and after the Revolution.
And then came lithography. You certainly had Toulouse-Lautrec, and you had Daumier.
Best known as the first political cartoonist, the first to reach a mass audience.
So the technology of cartoon art really got traction in the early 19th century with Daumier and the development of lithography.
Daumier comes along at a time when the political cartoon achieves a kind of mass availability through the development of something called the lithograph, where you can take a print from a stone, create a huge number of editions, and fuse the circulation of a newspaper with the expression, visual expression, of a political idea.
You know, you could get thrown in jail for doing this stuff. King Louis Philippe in France was particularly unfavorably disposed towards the cartoonists and tried to clamp down.
An early 19th century form that still gleams brightly, especially in the hand and eye of a Patrick Oliphant. The line connecting Honoré Daumier and Pat Oliphant is straight and true and razor sharp.
That's the one that got him put in the slammer. He got 6 months for this one.
The poor are feeding this bloated king.
Mm-hmm.
And he is excreting bills and medals and awards to his cronies.
It was always about drawing because that's how these people communicated. Words obviously were important, but it was the image which had to be striking visually and also potent politically.
Benjamin Franklin drew a serpent cut into pieces, under which he wrote the caption, "Unite or Die." For that, he's considered America's first political cartoonist.
In this day and age, and going back hundreds of years, visuals communicate immediately. And at the right time, in the right place, this guy named Thomas Nast shows up. And in the 1870s, he was the highest paid entertainer journalist in the world. He was everybody because of an illiterate population could connect with the drawings. He was massively popular, drawing for Harper's Weekly. He invented Santa Claus. He invented donkeys and elephants for political symbols. He is widely credited with putting the corrupt Boss Tweed in jail. He put the caricatures of Boss Tweed and his gang on the head of vultures. People saw that, and he was turned out of office.
Nast relentlessly caricatured the Tammany Hall crook until Tweed screamed, "Stop them damn pictures. I don't care so much what papers write about me. My constituents can't read, but damn it, they can see pictures."
Boss Tweed died in prison, and in his collection of works in prison was every Thomas Nast cartoon ever done on him.
You have the political class here who take themselves ever so seriously, and you've got the rest of us over here who don't. And the political cartoonists would work that gap, and it was an extremely potent form of commentary, very different from the written editorial.
Do you see that political cartoonists and their satire have had any profound effect?
Oh, no, of course not. Cartoons never changed anything. If they really did change anything, they'd throw us in the slammer. They did Dormier for a while, and they did Gilbray for a while. But if we were really having any effect at all, they'd do away with us in a nanosecond. A funny picture, they can cope with that. But on the other hand, the people who feel the way the cartoonist feels is comforted that somebody out there feels the way he does.
In 1967, my younger sister Susan was born.
I was born the year he won the Pulitzer. So for the life of those four people, not excluding me, life changed. But I wasn't part of that change. I was kind of experienced it from day one, you know? It was a different life. At that point, I didn't comprehend fame or how that influenced the family. I think the one thing about my dad was I started seeing him doing more.
The celebrity, the attention, the demands all began to take a toll on the marriage. And my mother grew in her certainty that she needed to be her own person, that her story couldn't just be about supporting him. That's not what he wanted anymore either. And that's what happens as people grow up. You know, I think they began to experience this really seismic shift in their relationship. And it wouldn't fully culminate until they moved to Washington, D.C. and separated and divorced. He moved from Denver and then to Washington. It was a big deal when he accepted a job at the Washington Star. This was a town that revolved around politics, which was his stock in trade. And his ability to poke fun at it and to get people to think differently about politicians and leaders and what they were up to.
It was a meeting of the man and the moment. On the other hand, the man had to have the skills to be able to meet the moment the way he did.
Pat went a level further and introduced really good humor in a personal way that had an initial bite and then a wonderful aftertaste. And it was clearly better and cooler than anything running in the late 70s, early 80s that I was aware of.
After the Washington Star folded, he went independent, which made him really the first cartoonist in the 20th century of his stature to not have a home newspaper. And for him, that was kind of nirvana, at the same time as it was a brave move, because it meant that he didn't have an editorial board looking over his shoulder telling him what he could and couldn't draw.
He was on top of the world, and he had a lot of newspapers.
Now he's so popular that a syndicate courier comes daily to his house to collect the latest creation.
My father's syndication, I think he was very intentional about it. He wanted to expand his reach, and it also happened in that his cartoons were increasingly popular. So there was a market for this, that a demand that he helped to fulfill.
Every morning he would wake up and have to look at the television or read the newspapers, see what had happened overnight, and decide what he thought was important and what he thought about it and how he was going to say that. And he had to do that before 12 noon.
So in the good old days, there was a 2-day lag of when your work would be available to syndicated customers. So not only did you have to think about today's news, you had to think about how today's news would play 2 days from now.
Do you know where it comes from? Where the knack to combine an idea and the art comes from? Or do you worry about waking up one morning and it'll be gone and you won't...
Well, you get over that in the first few years of doing it. I've done it 30 years now, so you don't worry about that too much. And where an idea comes from, I couldn't tell you. It's just where you do it every day and you develop a routine.
One of my things that I think is important if you're an artist is that you go to your studio every day, whether something happens or not. I think, in a sense, for some artists, it's happening all the time. And I think Patrick's one of those artists.
Susan was a curator and a gallery owner and committed to art. And she got to know Pat as an artist before she got to really know him as a cartoonist. And they formed a bond around that, which became a life partnership. And I love and admire Susan for the role that she has played with my father, the most fierce advocate and guardian for him that he could ever have hoped for. And they're good together. So it was a happy thing to see their marriage flourish the way that it has over the last few decades of both of their lives.
It takes a long time for everybody to know who I'm drawing. I don't want to label them. So eventually, the subject will start to look like the caricature. Everything comes together, and then you're in business. Politicians, they all come armed with trademarks, these people.
There was always something about Pat that distinguished him from top-tier cartoonists. One of the things I discovered when I got to know him was his work ethic and his insistence to improve, to innovate. He would videotape politicians and study the tapes like you do in football. And he would look for ticks or tells or habits that could convert into a better way of finding a chink in the armor of the bad guys.
Gerald Ford always had a Band-Aid. Jimmy Carter got noticeably smaller over time. Ronald Reagan noticeably blanker.
It's two small circles in the eyes seem to do it more than anything.
Oliphant says he gives each president a honeymoon, but sooner or later, usually sooner, they find their way onto his page.
But of all of his subjects, Richard Nixon remains Oliphant's apparent favorite.
And Nixon was a gift. It was sort of an ally to cartoonists.
For some reason, he likes to portray Nixon naked.
What is it about Nixon without his clothes on that fascinates you so much?
Doesn't fascinate me. I hate the thought.
Here's a Nixon cartoon of 1969.
Yeah, this is so. I had him looking fairly sinister there, I felt. But if you look at these later drawings of Nixon, you'll see how he has changed, become even more sinister.
How he felt about Nixon was pretty clear in his work. Nixon's handling of Vietnam, campus protests, street unrest, just general goings-on in the country. I think he adored the period of history, and he was absolutely intent on getting it right.
FBI officer Liddy and the CIA's McCord Jr. were convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and wiretapping of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate Hotel in Washington. They were part of a group of 7 men who broke into the offices to get first-hand information about Nixon's rival, George McGovern.
It was an opportunity to go deep into the psychology of a president who basically seemed to see himself almost as infallible in the office, and then challenge all of the current thinking about how he filled that office and what the responsibilities of the president were, and to poke fun at how the presidency was being lived out in that man.
I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I could say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Some cartoons are art, and some cartoons aren't art. Herb Bloch, his ideas were so brilliant, and they had power, but they weren't art somehow. They were cartoons. Some cartoonists are just lucky enough to produce art. If Pat's cartoons are art, I'm not articulate enough to explain the difference, but I know it exists.
When you're creating a cartoon, it requires 3 very distinct operations.
He judges himself on 3 things. First, the idea.
You have to synthesize the issue, come up with your angle.
And then the drawing.
They have to come up with an image that has to register clearly.
And then the text.
And then you've got to write a caption for it that's funny.
And he said he almost never got all 3. Rarely, he thought. But he's a very tough judge on his own work.
To my mind, Patrick is the only person who was ever able to do that at such a high level that he was really the only one I ever looked at.
His draftsmanship is absolutely amazing. I mean, since I come from an art background, I mean, the thing that we learned was, great foundation in your drawing. A Pat Oliphant drawing is so solid. He knows how to draw figures so well that you can step on them and stomp them and they'll still stay there. They won't crumble.
Some days it's easy. Some days it's difficult. It just depends on the day. I just rough out the idea. I just draw it in loosely, and I'll change it as I go along, of course. But this is just to get the idea down as a layout, just to get an idea of the perspectives, how it'll look, how it'll place in the frame, and what it looks like. Then, having done that and written the caption underneath, whatever it is, then I'll work the finished drawing.
Do you have any idea how many American cartoonists imitate him? Practically all of them. The minute somebody comes up with something strong and effective, as Pat has done, they all just fall all over each other unashamedly, trying to draw exactly like him.
When people, see something work so well, they want to imitate. Tom Towles has a little side sketch in the corner of himself that seems to be kind of an homage to Oliphant. And again, it's a sign that Oliphant really was a master at what he was doing.
Others were successful copying his early style. Three-time Pulitzer winner Jeff McNally actually confessed to that he would rip off Oliphant every opportunity he got. Pat knew that, kind of bugged him. So Pat would change his style.
If you look at his earlier editorial cartooning work, it's very cartoony, like most editorial cartoonists. Nothing wrong with it, it's just a style.
It would go from what I'm recalling as 60s, 70s, simple, real simple lines using Zipatome, which was a film shading device, to a looser, more early 19th century Daumier Goya style.
And the way he does it, he says, is that he keeps doing life drawing. He knows so much about what the human figure does that he can bring it to mind and put it right on the page. It's all in here.
Pat worked so hard at his craft that he didn't have to think about what he was drawing. It just flowed through his left-handed fingertips. It's a little bit like watching a concert pianist not having to read the sheet music. It's already there.
His work has a freedom which I sorely envy. It's very hard to do something that has anger in it, and yet the line is not angry, the line is beautiful and flows. In comic art, the whole clue is to make it look easy. If it looks labored, it stops being funny. Pat stuff looks as though he didn't work too hard at it. I know he works hard at it, but it doesn't show.
Jerry Ford came to the White House. He was sort of difficult to draw because there were no trademark things about him. And so I gave him this. He was very amusing fella because he fell down ladders and he fell down stairs. Jerry Ford I liked as a person. He called up one day, long after I left the Oval Office, and he said, well, we're having an annual meeting of my old staff. I wonder if you'd come along and be the entertainment, or whatever it was. I don't know why I did this, but I walked over to him and I used charcoal and I drew a Band-Aid on his forehead. He looked at me and said, well, what's going on? The Secret Service said, you do that again and you'll never draw in this town again. I had terrible time trying to convince people that maybe this wasn't a good idea to have a president like this, because everybody liked him. I had a very difficult job convincing people that maybe we were on the wrong track.
Come on. Go, watch it, Bonzo. Steady. Hey, Bonzo. And action.
Pat certainly felt strongly about Reagan and the rise of the religious right and what that represented for the country. He also did this incredible series of cartoons on the Cold War and the nuclear arms buildup. He wasn't afraid to take on the Reagan administration for their role in bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war and nuclear Armageddon.
In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
The record shows that every time an American hostage was released, there had been a major shipment of arms just before that.
What would be wrong with saying that a mistake was made on a very high-risk gamble so that you can get on with the next 2 years?
Because I don't think a mistake was made. One thing still upsetting me, however, is that no one kept proper records of meetings or decisions. This led to my failure to recollect whether I approved an arms shipment before or after the fact. I did approve it. I just can't say specifically when.
We're getting into caricature again. He didn't have a chin like that, but it felt like he did. I always had him wearing glasses because when he first campaigned, he took off his glasses. He thought it made him look wimpy. So for all the rest of us who wear glasses, I always had him wear glasses. And I also, just to make the point a little stronger, I gave him a purse. Which he didn't like, so who cares?
I didn't really take to Clinton. There was something see-throughable about him. He never really convinced me of his sincerity.
As a cartoonist, you don't often get a chance to depict the president in bed with a voluptuous female.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong. It constituted a critical lapse in judgment and a personal failure on my part for which I am solely and completely responsible. I misled people, including even my wife. I deeply regret that.
I'm trying to remember what I think of Bush, because you sort of forget all of this. But it was smaller than life, so I drew him that way.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. May God bless our country and all who defend her.
I liked Obama. He could put words together that we haven't had a president do very well. He could form sentences and keep the subject central in what he was saying for amazing amounts of time.
We will rebuild, we will recover, and the United States of America will emerge stronger than before.
Just wasn't used to that. I'm not an admirer of politicians. I think I may have made that clear.
Although the majority of my father's cartoons focus on the American political scene, he also covered other issues and topics that he felt strongly about. His cartoons on the environment, for example, spanned many administrations. He always had a sharp eye out for government, for corporate and institutional overreach, for anything that smacked to him of collusion and corruption and control and censorship. Basically anything that looked like it was the creeping in of autocracy and crowding out of democracy and decent behavior. I think decency was his metric. He did a whole series of powerful cartoons on apartheid in South Africa. All the way through to Freedom and Nelson Mandela. For decades, his cartoons on the conflict in the Middle East illuminated the tension and the violence and the hope and the dashed hope. In many ways, the same story still going on today. He felt strongly about AIDS and the country's response to AIDS. He also did cartoons from time to time that were tributes to fallen heroes or just moments to remember and to honor. It was his passion and his duty to try to make America and the world a little better place. He was taking his gift, his craft, and using it to shine a light every single day on democracy and the people who led us, so that maybe we would take it a little more seriously the next day. My father is a true artist and was always consumed with his work.
This is a matter of hours of thinking and getting myself into a state of mind where I can go at it.
When he did that, he was intense. And he wanted quiet, and he wanted space, and he wanted to be left alone. As a kid, of course, you know, what I felt in those moments, seems ridiculous to say it now, but I felt afraid, like I was walking on eggshells, because we didn't want to disturb him in those moments. You know, my older sister Laura was the strongest in terms of being willing to speak up and stand up for herself. She was also an artist and driven by her own creative curiosities. She would speak up and say, hey, pay attention at certain times. My younger sister, Susan, was a very creative, driven person in her own right, but I think she never really had a chance to engage with my father, and that's a shame.
When we moved to D.C., the thought was we would all live together in D.C., but that wasn't his plan. And so he gave the keys to my mom and said, I'm not moving in. Getting to know him again was difficult, but I don't have any anger with him now. Did I when I was growing up? Sure. The times that I did finally get to spend with him in my 40s meant more to me than almost anything in the 40 years before that. And I got to know the man a lot better. And that's when the forgiveness happens.
My dad and I, at one point a few years ago, had a really poignant moment of reflecting. We were sitting on his back patio talking about the world and his upbringing and what it was like to be him. And then, kind of out of the blue, turned to me and said, you know, I was a lousy dad and I'm sorry. I sort of looked at him, I said, yeah, and you were also engaged in a lot of interesting ways, and it's important that you hold on to that as well, you know. And I think he realized, looking back at his life, there were ways in which he could have done that differently. Good for him. I have many good memories of being his son and of feeling like this was a really interesting guy to be the son of.
Getting exposed to him as a person was interesting to me, and I got to appreciate it more and more as I got older. Not only his artwork, but his intelligence and his humor. And I think that's where we bonded, was the humor. Because we would sit at dinner and just, I don't know, we'd have each other cracking up. And that was fun. I enjoyed that.
Pat had this plan to be in Santa Fe and be an artist, which is a place he had wanted to live for decades. He made that move later in his life than he wanted to. And the point in his life where he was going to step from the one ice floe to the other, his eyesight began to fail.
One of the unfortunate things about eyesight is that it deteriorates.
A few years ago, we found that he couldn't see very well, and so they diagnosed him with macular degeneration, and then it got worse, and they diagnosed him. He also has glaucoma, and you can take shots for the macula, which he gets every month, in his eyes, but the only thing you can do for glaucoma so far is certain drops, and so he has drops. So I think 4 different things he has to take every day.
Hopefully that'll save something as far as eyesight is concerned.
It's really a very difficult disease process to control. There are certain things that be done to slow it down, but it's not really something that we have a cure for at this point. And as somebody whose whole life has been centered around visual world, that's been, I think, a very devastating process for him.
One thing that sort of sustained political cartooning was the old news cycle. You'd have your newspaper first thing in the morning, and then the evening news at night, and then rinse and repeat. There is no news cycle anymore. It's 24/7.
First came television, which took away a lot of advertising for artists. Then came the computer, which took away even more advertising from the artists and put the magazines out of business. Suddenly, there are very few cartoonists who can make a living anymore.
Our country was born from political protest. Yet, it's sad to see that the financial picture of the media is making it harder and harder for that to happen.
That's what makes this kind of work challenging all around the country. It is what is making journalism challenging around the country. But it's not just the changing nature of the business model, it's also the willingness of editors and publishers to take the heat for doing honest work.
One of the trends that is terribly disturbing is the profit-making corporations taking over the media.
Rob Rogers, who was the cartoonist at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, his publisher told him to stop doing so many cartoons about Donald Trump because he was, quote unquote, becoming too obsessed with the president.
Rob was 30 years on that paper. I mean, his publisher knew damn well who he was and what he did. I mean, every editorial cartoonist gets stuff spiked, like a couple a year. He got 6 spiked in a matter of weeks, all Trump cartoons.
When the President of the United States every day does something that is newly offensive and an affront to democracy and civil liberties, for a cartoonist not to be doing that work is absolutely insane.
The financial troubles of journalism are making it harder and harder for cartoonists to work and find jobs and get their voice out there. We should be able to criticize our president. That is American.
Liebling once said, yes, there's a free press in this country for anyone who owns one.
Newspapers more worried about the bottom line and popularity and things like that, even though most of the mastheads on newspapers were there to seek the truth.
Political cartooning is a form of satire, and satire turns on mockery, and mockery is about giving offense. So if you can't do that anymore, you don't have political cartoons.
In this new era of political correctness, one hurt feeling call to an editor may translate into not just one, but a whole movement of cancel my subscription, or even worse, an advertiser boycott.
When I was president of the AAC, the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists, and Trump had just become president, my biggest concern was, everything he had been saying about the press. We're going to change the libel laws. I thought, oh, great. Who's going to be in the firing line? It's going to be an editorial cartoonist.
Because they are the fake, disgusting news.
The New York Times doesn't like editorial cartoons. They have been looking for a reason to get rid of them for years. So this was like the perfect opportunity for them.
Did you see that the New York Times discontinued political cartoons after being accused of anti-Semitism with that Trump cartoon?
I did see it, yeah. What I remember, well, he was being led by Netanyahu.
Yes, he was being led by Netanyahu.
Yeah, well, in a way he is. What's wrong with that?
This is a common problem that it's a mistake that an editorial cartoonist can do, that when you're criticizing the state of Israel, which we're allowed to do, right? You should always use the flag, not the Star of David.
The Star of David is on the flag of Israel. Come on, I mean, that's...
Editorial cartoons are really tailor-made for today and for social media. They're visual, they're instantly consumable. They're in the format of a meme, but they're handcrafted and they're layered with meaning. And they're curated by an artist, trying to really express his voice. Social media has given huge platform and power to those of us and practitioners of free speech and those of us who want to speak out for those of what's right and express our voice, like cartoonists, writers, comedians. Social media is amazing.
Pat's work is great. It's the old school version of what a satirical meme is nowadays. Newspaper satirists are kind of a dying breed, and memes are kind of taking up that mantle. There's always a bunch of meme guys, like people that can always be memed. Anyone in politics is always fair game. Especially during the Trump era, it's prime fodder for jokes and memes. Pat's style really lent itself to getting the point across quickly, which is exactly what a meme is supposed to do. Modern day society, people are only going to look at something for 2 seconds. It has to be a recognizable image, and they have to get the point across in a split second before they scroll away forever.
Pat Oliphant's hand has been following his nose, his instincts, for nearly 30 years now. His sharp pencil stabbing at the heart of issues and public officials.
Well, we shouldn't think of the cartoon as a funny drawing. It's supposed to be a serious expression of political thought.
My favorite piece that he ever did was The Running of the Altar Boys. First of all, it was incredibly brave when it came out. It was the sort of first wave of the scandal emerging around pedophilia in the Catholic Church. Hugely controversial. Got a massive backlash from people who thought he was being unfair.
One of the greatest cartoons of our time. A brilliant, brilliant cartoon. Everybody was all uptight about letting you make fun of the church. By the 1970s, you could make fun of presidents and diplomats and all sorts of that, but you could never make fun of the church.
It's a big political organization. Why not? They're sitting there with their asses hanging in the wind, and you kick them.
I don't believe that I deliberately stay away from anything. I've always found that cartoons that touch upon people's personal beliefs are far more explosive than cartoons that touch upon their political beliefs.
In 2015 was the massacre at the offices of Charlie Hebdo, where 5 cartoonists and 7 of their colleagues were assassinated basically for the sin of satire and for drawing. Messing with people's ideas around religiosity is dangerous.
Pat uniquely showed courage to go after folks that were otherwise beyond reproach or too dangerous to touch. Pat swallowed hard and went after him.
They like to have their, whether they know it or not, their ideas upset, and then they can get mad and react to it.
Yeah, you got a lot of hate mail. Frankly, for a cartoonist, hate mail is high congratulation that you've hit your target.
You know, I remember him getting death threats. He sort of dismissed that rather lightly, and he even kept a stamp on his desk that was marked bullshit.
You can be so savage with humor. Ridicule is probably one of the strongest forms of indictment.
He said, you gotta wake up every morning angry.
Most of all, I think it's to start a dialogue between people, make people write to the editor, get mad as you are. One of the things a cartoonist does for other people, he articulates their hates and their dislikes as well.
He just didn't care what the political establishment wanted. And he continued to do that in confronting all manner of establishment over the years.
I think he challenges. I think that he feels that's what he must do, you know. If he sees some injustice or some crooked thing happening, I mean, I think he feels it's incumbent on him to say it.
Cartooning should be a savage art, I think. The function of a cartoon is to be patting anyone on the back, being friendly. You can't have a positive cartoon. You shouldn't be able to have a positive cartoon.
You're selling ideas, and you're trying to motivate the audience to actually think in a certain way. Pat's often fond of saying, in a strong cartoon, there's no on the other hand. It's a rifle shot aimed at a target.
The core of cartooning was to confront people with difficult or unpleasant truths and to make them think about whatever it was that was the subject.
It's a way of getting to the truth.
They really do have that kind of power, and this is why King Louis Philippe was throwing people in jail. They didn't want those subversive ideas out in circulation.
You know, there's a mischievousness about him, but it's constructive mischievousness. He was looking at life through a different lens, and that lens was to look for the humor, look for the thing that would be his doorway into confronting people with a different reality. Oddly, my dad, who I think tested the boundaries all the time, also had limits, and he had a sense of reverence for moments that were politically important or just in human terms important. So in those moments, he would refrain from humor, and he would refrain even from inserting punk. I also saw punk in very serious cartoons where punk would just be standing there and looking.
I remember Susan telling me, Pat's made some sculptures and we're going to have an exhibition. I can't wait for you to see them. And I said, great, I can't either. But secretly I was thinking, uh-oh, you know, is this really going to work? Or is it going to be like, you know, those Hollywood celebrities who suddenly decide they're painters? I walked into the exhibition and they were outstanding sculptures. He understands three-dimensional form.
He never did any sculpture until 1985, about.
He is virtually self-taught in all of his artistic endeavors, including painting, lithography, and, as of a couple years ago, sculpting.
What inspired him was an exhibition at the National Gallery of Rodin's work. He said to himself, I could do that. People are so focused on his political cartoon drawings. A lot of people still don't know that he does sculpture.
They're finding their way into the museums now. National Portrait Gallery has a collection of his presidents. Sometimes it's kind of fun to be a fly on the wall and watch how people work when they go into certain gallery spaces and what they see first and what pulls them in. It's a sculpture.
He says a few days of thinking about it and a few hours of execution created a Ronald Reagan desperately trying to stay in the saddle of a bucking bronco. From a slumping, mountainous Tip O'Neill to what he calls his gallery of bureaucrats, it is clear Oliphant is as piercing with wax, plaster, and bronze as he is with a pencil.
It's always been a great enjoyment, all of that stuff. And one has supplemented the other. It's all been part of one thing.
This is a side of Pat's work that's probably not as well known as it could be or should be, but it's definitely right up there with his two-dimensional work.
Painting was always part of what he wanted to do. He liked that as a form of artistic expression. My earliest memory of my father painting is also my earliest memory of him doing cartooning. He was always painting. When I was a kid growing up in Denver, there were always paintings that he was working on or hanging on the wall that he had done. My father was always experimenting, painting, sculpture, and stop motion animation. He was an artist. He was focused on whatever it was that he was experimenting with or doing at that time.
I think the last few years have been very difficult. It's been difficult for his friends to see kind of his deterioration physically. The idea of him losing his eyesight, I think, is terrifying.
We both shared this love of art and of museums and conversations about all that, and now he can't see those things.
There is a grace that he's handled all of that stuff with, but it's hard to see that kind of genius just kind of blocked by age.
Watching my dad reach a point where he had to stop cartooning has been much more difficult than I would have thought. You know, in part because a moment like that confronts us all with our own mortality and you know, the sense of time catching up with any of us.
How do you tell somebody who draws so great and has had such an incredible, prolific career that they can't see? It's made me feel closer to him in an odd kind of way. I want to do everything I can in my mind for him to feel better about it. But how do you do that, you know? If Patrick is depressed, which he doesn't show at all, but we've talked about it, and he says he goes through spells of it. But I mean, you think of all of the assholes that he's been around over these last years, and it's totally understandable, this depression. You know, the whole country's depressed.
I've hoped to get back into the saddle again and start drawing again, but you know, realistically, probably not. But at the same time, I'd like to kid myself. Maybe I can. So.
One of the wonderful things that Pat has done for the study of history and the study of the presidency and American politics is he has left a generation and a half's worth of views through a single lens.
My dad and I were talking yesterday about what 60 years of effort amounts to. Like a lot of people looking back on their careers, he wondered what difference did that all make? And as I thought about that later, but also as I talked with him in the moment, it not only chronicled what happened during those 60 years, but he helped shape the narrative of what happened in those 60 years in a way that is more influential than many of us will ever be able to. He was read by decision makers. They feared what he had to say and they feared his pen. They also loved it. They feared not being noticed by him. And when that's true of you, you're helping to shape the narrative of the times that you're in.
When Pat Oliphant came to work at the Washington Star in 1975, we were all beyond excited. We were going to have the most famous political cartoonist in the world. Pat could determine the fate of a politician with a few strokes of his brush. With a glint in his eye, he referred to his work as stirring up the beast. Besides Pat, the most famous person at the Star was Mary McGrory, the liberal lioness, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist who made Nixon's enemies list. Mary had famous parties. She made the politicians and the journalists do amateur theatrics. Once Pat showed up, Mary demanded that he sing Waltzing Matilda. He told Mary what she could do with Matilda besides waltzing, and walked out muttering, "The hell I will." When I wrote my first book, Bush World, about the rush to the Iraq War, my publishers asked me what I wanted for the cover. There was only one person I wanted to do it. When the cover was finished, it showed a tiny W as a gunslinger emerging from a scary Gothic White House. I was a little afraid we would get hammered for making W too diminutive, a shrimpy cowboy. I didn't have the nerve to call Pat myself, so I made the managing editor call Pat and ask him to make W just a tad bigger. When Pat's revised cover came back, W was even smaller. We did one book event for the book together in Santa Fe. Afterwards, I confessed to Pat that the anger and hate and vile comments were beginning to wear me down. He looked at me, his eyes widening in surprise. "You've got it all wrong," he chided me. "That's the fun part. That's why we do this." After Pat said that to me, I suddenly realized how much courage he had and how much courage I would need to keep going and do my job properly. And I vowed from that day forward to stir up the beast even more ferociously.
What Pat did in terms of challenging the status quo was, to me, quintessentially American. He got a lot of blowback from people who had the whole love it or leave it mentality. And we're seeing it again now. This notion that if you're challenging the way things are, you must not love America. And I think the core of being an American is actually challenging what you don't agree with and being willing to call a foul when you see a foul. And that's what Pat Oliphant did.
I told him even last time I saw him in 2022, I said, I miss seeing what you have to say about this, you know, because he had such a good insight and a clever insight and a very cutting insight. You know, he said how it was. And I think we could actually use some of that right now, some intelligent analysis in a humorous way.
Pat is an outstanding cartoonist, but he was lucky in his timing because the country was changing, it was going crazy, and you had these larger-than-life figures like LBJ and Nixon. The man had to have the skills to be able to meet the moment the way he did. So it's lucky for him he came over here from Australia, but it's also lucky for us.
Pat's work and career will be a beacon to show you where the top of the craft is.
The biggest thing he gave to cartoonists was the way he went after both sides, the way he went after issues ruthlessly and with such artistry. I haven't seen a cartoonist in my lifetime achieve such excellence in all categories of his work.
Did I influence public opinion? I'd like to think so. I really have no, I really don't collect that sort of thing. I don't really know. If people can look at my work and say, hey, that wasn't bad, that's pretty good. If they could say that, then I think I've done what I'm supposed to do. To leave a legacy of drawing and humor. And I think that'll be okay.
things are not always what they seem. I was driving once, behind a car like this, and there was a fella here, and there's an open sports car, and he's driving here, and there's the windshield. Beautiful long-haired creature next to him like this. And I was just going to get up alongside and see what she looked like. And she turned and looked at him. And so you have to establish what you're drawing and where the spare parts are coming from.